Dr. Tunapi, Dr. Ramesh Kalkatagi, Dr. Gowda, honored participants, ladies and gentlemen. As I went through this very detailed and well thought through program, for this keynote address, I've simply taken the title of the national seminar and tried to put as many of the strands together as I can to give you food for thought and the opportunities to look beyond your own personal areas of interest as you go through the rest of the program. As Dr. Tunapi said, I'm bringing almost 30 years of experience across Africa and Asia and bringing my own personal thoughts into this. And one of the key things that comes to me is that meeting the SDGs, particularly SDG 2, has too many challenges. We have war, civil unrest, climate change, pandemics, demands to produce more food with less land and fewer inputs. It's a real challenge. So in stark contrast from our over-reliance on the big three, the rice, wheat, and maize, there's 30,000 plant species which are edible, of which over 7,000, such as the millets, fonio, teff, yam, cassava, bambra, groundnut, jackfruit, mangosteen, sesame, okra. The list is endless. But those are still parts of the diets of many communities around the world. But with the rise of industrial agriculture, for the best of reasons, the diversity on our plates has reduced, less so in India, I must admit, but very much so in other countries, because those crops amenable to large-scale farming have come to dominate our diets. And why is this an issue? To me, it's because although there are economies of scale, there is greater potential risk of climate change and other issues when we don't have diversity on farms, especially for our smallholder farmers. A recent analysis of over 2.5 million yield observations from National Agricultural Census data has documented the widespread stagnation of yield growth. So maize, soybean, wheat, and rice are crucial. Wheat and rice particularly feed people, almost minimally livestock. Stagnating food grain yields combined with the growing population is a prospect that we really should avoid. If you look at that picture, you'll see rice production. You'll also see some pollution in the background. Estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which is about 1/4 of the global greenhouse gas emissions, ranges from about 15 to 20% from direct farming activities. If food production is more broadly defined to include processing, packaging, transport, sale of agricultural products, and so on, then the greenhouse gas emissions are up to about 43 to 57%. Agriculture contributes quite a lot. I'm not going to be talking about mitigation. Later, I will talk about adaptation. At the beginning, in the first half of this presentation, I want to discuss the problems that climate change is bringing us. Water is one of our most precious commodities. We often don't have enough, and sometimes we have too much, with accompanying flooding. And I heard from Dr. Ramesh just now that Hyderabad is really hot. Oh yes, but when it rains, oh my goodness, it's pouring down the streets. It's that sort of thing, that combination that we're going to have to deal with. But we're becoming more and more reliant on bore wells rather than capturing rainwater.
Hello?
And groundwater depths vary according to geology, also according to replenishment and usage. In general, our water tables, particularly in the hotter and drier areas, are falling by about 1/2 meter per year, 30 centimeters to 50 centimeters per year from water extraction. We need potable water, drinkable water. We also need water for agriculture and for industry. And I was curious at what the water table is doing globally. And the Punjab, as you all know, has been suffering issues on the drop of the groundwater. In many places, it's about 30 meters. In Texas, which I imagine to be very dry, 23 meters. Alice Springs, right in the middle of Australia, very arid, is between 15 and 90 meters down. And in the Gobi Desert, a real desert, it's between 50 and 170 meters down. That is a long way, and the more we draw and the less we replenish, the worse it's going to get. Globally, we do have enough food, but it's often in the wrong place at the wrong time and not affordable. We've got to be more efficient while at the same time preserving our environment for ourselves and future generations. Overnutrition is often a result of our lifestyles. Undernutrition is often because of the food, especially nutritious food, is simply not available. Food crops grow well in temperate or cooler zones. Crops in the tropics often have pest and disease issues, as well as eroded and infertile soils to contend with. So climate change is impacting all of us, and it will continue and will cause warming and extreme weather events, even if we maximize our response right now. We've got rising sea levels, climatic events, increased water flow in rivers from meltwater, which puts the coast at risk. Future population, if you look at the diagram to the right, exposure to inundation with a one in a 100-year event and sea level rise. Europe has a lot of coastal areas, highly productive in terms of agriculture, and it's at risk. But look at Asia. The number of people at risk is going to be very high, up to about double the current level of 47 million people at risk. We've got to do something about these matters. And all these impacts affect us in different ways. Agriculture, coasts, our ecologies, in which everything survives, our water, our trees, our power, our transport, health, society. And I'm going to briefly touch on these interlocking issues. For our crops, we know that increased levels of CO2 should help most plants grow faster. With CO2 increased, we're going to expect temperature shifts, climatic events. These will reduce yields. High productivity comes with the risk of different partitioning of photosynthase, different accumulation of micronutrients. Our crops may grow faster, but they may not have better grain and forage quality. It may be worse. Pollinators may not be available. Flowering may be affected by frost. Heat, pollen in hotter zones may become inviable, and pests and diseases may become more prevalent, and new pests may become a problem. If we look at livestock, and just out of interest, the USA consumes 36 million metric tons of meat and poultry annually. But apart from heat stress, which reduces fertility and milk production, there may be less fodder. With all of this, there's likely to be change in veterinary practices to minimize parasites, and other health treatments are going to be needed in response to climate-induced increases in pests, diseases, microbes. You're going to get those pesticides into the food chain. Fisheries, marine and freshwater are likely to be affected too. Temperature changes, currents, water flow, they affect reproduction and migration, and the growth of farmed fish as well. That's especially so because in shallow water, the temperatures of the water are going to go up. So contained tanks and ponds will suffer more. Higher temperatures can bring in more diseases to fish as well. Shellfish may be unable to incorporate soluble calcium into their shells because of acidification of the ocean. Coastal areas, in many cases, they are under threat, and we resort to defenses, coastal defenses, to protect our coasts. Apart from disruption to the ecosystems, underwater and above water, and to the livelihoods along the coast of the people, including tourism. Major disruptions will also affect transportation and the ability to use the coastline and the oceans for transport. Our ecosystems are being affected today, even if we don't look as far forward as 2050. Our mountains, the Arctic ecosystems are particularly vulnerable. Warming of our environment melts snow and ice, resulting in rising sea levels and also the potential for floods from mountain ecosystems from the meltwater. So the ice melts in the Himalayas and you see the problem in India and Bangladesh. Our water, so precious, is being affected by climate change. The image, excuse me, shows what happens on the left when precipitation is impeded. Drought, dry lands, less productivity. We can also get saltwater incursion into coastal water supplies for drinking and irrigation. On the right, where there's more precipitation, higher humidity, and equally less productivity because this climate situation was not anticipated in that particular area. Our forests, so important to us as an ecology, and they've been challenged by mankind ever since we started farming. They've been challenged by the need to produce more food for timber and other tree products. We're seeing major forest fires being reported. Many start naturally, and forest fires have always been part of the ecosystem, but these fires seem to be bigger and are impinging on our lives and much more, burning homes, towns, and destroying forest livelihoods. So energy, the greater our population, the greater consumers that we are, the more energy we need. In summer, like in Hyderabad, we want to be cool. In winter, we need to keep warm. We need power to process food, for transportation, to make consumer products. We've seen what disruption to oil supplies has done to Europe when there was the restriction on bringing oil from Russia. And what has that done to the cost of energy and those ripple effects moving down to the consumers in the end? Climate change, sea level rise, extreme weather events will disrupt power supply even further. Even trying to produce green power can be challenging. Storms can disrupt wind turbines, pollution and dust reduce the efficiency of solar panels, hydroelectric power needs water, but the water might not be available. On human health, climate change impacts our health. The hotter it is, the more uncomfortable we feel, the less productive we are. Working at 40 degrees Celsius is a bit difficult and not good for you. The warmer the climate becomes, we can expect more diseases, a less good prognosis from lifestyle diseases, poor air quality from dust, smoke, and inversion layers trapping city pollution, bearing in mind that half our population will be urban by 2050. It seems to me that our health sectors are going to have a huge cost burden to try and manage the impact of climate change on our health and productivity. This image is self-explanatory. Storms, flooding, wind, cold, ice, all affect our transport systems. And while in the medium and long term we can plan to address those, in the short term, the impact disrupts our lives and cost of transport will increase as the number of options available for us decreases. Those disruptions of transport seem out of scope almost for agriculture, but they affect food production, processing, and distribution. Where transport is hampered, we see some of the bigger incidences of food loss, famine, starvation. From what I've been saying, climate change affects each and every one of us, our environments, our food systems. Where we as individuals are affected, our families are affected, and our societies are affected. Our cities are getting hotter. They flood more easily. Transport systems are needed to bring the food to our doors, and they're vulnerable. And as our systems and our societies become more stressed, it will be the poor, the disadvantaged, and the vulnerable who will suffer the most. The IPCC report for 2022 highlights these points. Agricultural productivity growth has slowed, particularly in the mid and low altitudes, and much of Africa and South Asia is situated in those latitudes, which are regions with high populations, high levels of poverty, hunger, and food and nutrition security. The report mentions the key biological events that I've mentioned, flowering, for example, which is likely to become affected. Pests and disease will increase and control will be more difficult, more costly. And the impacts on food availability and nutritional quality will increase the number of people at risk of hunger, malnutrition, and diet-related mortality. Sorry, excuse me. All those climate issues that I brought to your attention will interact with everything else. Where we make a change in one area, almost everything else shifts. Some of those outcomes will be deliberate, things that we've put forward, as Dr. Tanapi said, in a policy paper. But there will be many, many unintended consequences that we can't even imagine. So there are no easy answers. And that's why we're all gathered here today and tomorrow. There are some solutions. There are some promising approaches, and I'll go through some of them. But I want you to keep remembering that although we're talking about agriculture here, and agriculture, I'm not even going to talk about the livestock and the fisheries, just crops. Everything we do to those crops has a roll-on effect somewhere and somehow, whether it's to the soil, the environment, the transportation, the forests, the societies, the way we get our income, how do we transport materials to the farms and back out. There are so many possibilities, and that's why we need multidisciplinary discussions in the hopes that we'll capture most of the unintended consequences while we go for the outputs and outcomes that we envision for the future. Remembering that the future, none of us can see. We're using all the data we can to model it, but we really don't know what's going to happen. COVID, we couldn't have even guessed that we were going to have a global pandemic. So I strongly believe we have to modernize our agricultural systems to make them more efficient, to make agriculture more resilient. Farmers are risk averse, and they should be, because their livelihoods come from the soil. And agriculture is known for being super conservative. Nonetheless, somehow we need to change the way our farmers farm so that the farming systems become more resilient and the productivity is increased sustainably. We must modernize if we're going to feed the growing population without cutting down more forests, without restricting other things. Even if to meet the sustainable development goals in the short, medium term, it's going to be difficult. And we've got to consider, let's say 2050, because it's almost imaginable to most of us. We've got to feed and nourish those generations. Digital platforms might not be modern outside of agriculture, but used properly can create a step change in our agricultural systems, because digital platforms by their very nature create a facilitating environment, both for farmers, private sector, and to make agriculture profitable at all scales. These tools are very critical, and there's so many advances, as I said, outside of agriculture, but that muddy, literally, interface between technologies and the practicalities of producing food on the ground does not always support the uptake of new technologies. But with the right digital tools, farming will become logical, decisions based on data, not guesswork and experience, And we can have transparency in supply chains so that we can better manage the farms and our environment. And if we can get those right tools, the absolute right tools to the farmers and the value chain actors, we won't have to take them to them. There will be a technology pull, and the technology will be wanted so much that our partners will need to work very hard to ensure that there is enough of the technology at scale and with the necessary support. Disruptive technologies bring change. They're also a little bit scary because they're disrupting what we know to be the world. But we do have opportunities in natural resource management, nutrient management and soil, pest and disease control, post-harvest, finance, and also in aggregation. I put it to you that nutrient and natural resource management can be done haphazardly. With your experience, you look at the soil, you look at the plants, and maybe wishful thinking, or to ensure yields at whatever cost you put on whatever inputs you need. But we can make it so much more cost effective using sensors and artificial intelligence to minimize wastage and contamination and pollution. But the tools must be very well tested. The outputs must be buying into the risk-averse nature of agriculture. The instruments have to be robust, solid, reliable, climate-proofed, and the information to our farmers clear, easy to understand, and above all, easy to implement. To support the farmer, we need to get our technologies out quickly. One hurdle has always been the time taken to get tested new varieties to the farmers. In the past, it could have taken 10, 15 or more years of trial and error, and we do not have that luxury in the face of climate change. We need to breed new varieties for 5 years' time for a future climate and environment. So we can shorten the breeding cycle of many crops so that the new varieties can be tested and released sooner. We also have gene editing now, a possibility to improve the quality of the crops, the varieties going out. We need seed systems that will pick up the new varieties very quickly, multiply them very fast, assuring seed quality, and get the seed to the farmers as soon as possible. As I said, a scientist can fix the breeding, but there's everything else around getting the varieties there, making sure they're the right ones that the consumers want, that the value addition needs. We know those consequences, the unintended ones, unknown. With the pests and diseases I've been talking about that may increase in numbers very quickly in new climate, we could get new ones coming in, strong winds blow new pests in. The new weather systems is going to aggravate that situation. And I keep telling people that many years ago when I was in Nigeria, we had those really heavy duty satellite phones. Then mobile phones came into play, the very simple ones, and then smartphones like this one. I don't recall a lot of advertising for those phones. Everybody wanted them. Everybody wants them now. Almost everybody has got a mobile phone. Nigeria, a lot of countries in West Africa took a step change. They bypassed having landlines and went straight for mobile phone technology. A step change. And that was technology pull. So that's why I keep saying that our technologies should be so good that the farmers demand them more and more. So going back to the mobile phones that almost every farmer has around the world, the great thing about having the applications on their mobile phones is that the decision-making can be in their hands. And that is vital to speed up the farmer's response time, in this case to pests and diseases, so that the crop can be saved and quality produce harvested. And with proper timely advice, this should also minimize the use of inputs, pesticides generically, as the farmer will be given accurate advice and won't have the unnecessary expense on unneeded application of pesticides. And these applications, such as Plantix, covers 30 crops as in 18 languages. I'm very proud of it coming from ICRISAT. However, what about the new crops that we're going to have to grow in a changing climate, or the pests and diseases that haven't come yet, but as a plant pathologist, I'm expecting them to come very soon. I mentioned minimizing food loss, produce loss, food wastage, while at the same time assuring that more of the cost that the consumer pays goes back to the farmer. It has to find its way back to the farm gate. We have too many middlemen in the way. All our crops are vulnerable to loss and waste, whether from field pests, the absence of a cold chain for horticultural produce, storage pests in silos, fungi releasing toxins, off flavors, and so on. The system after harvest has been so heavily reliant on the consolidators and middlemen, and I look for the transparency, the shortest possible value chains, and the opportunities to minimize loss and deterioration, to maximize value addition and money going back to the farmers. We'll get this transparency if we can give more information, more data, and with produce tracking, so we know what's happened to it, for example, through blockchain. And with climate change, crop insurance becomes even more important. Farming is becoming more risky. The unknown and the unexpected can happen at any time. In Asia, only about 22% of smallholder farmers have access to insurance, while in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 3%. There is a high transaction cost from collecting premium amounts, which are very often small, and then you have to carry out the loss assessment in case of adverse weather events. Digital platforms, remote sensing can eliminate the pain points. So this is all about the managing of the consequences of climate change. So adaptation and not mitigation. And to further adapt, if you recall right at the beginning, I was saying rice, wheat, and maize, economies of scale. Those farms for those crops are huge. Fields cover many hundreds of hectares. Large machinery such as combine harvesters are often working in teams to harvest the crops. If we can aggregate farm equipment digitally, I was using the Uber example, if we can aggregate the farm equipment in the global south, because not everybody, small scale farmers cannot afford the big equipment. If we can have small farm, large field approach, promote mechanization of agriculture and those economies while cutting down on costs, but still ensuring that we generate employment at the village level, district level. We need to encourage entrepreneurs. We need to make sure that there is opportunity to bring in funding, microfinance somehow. The startups in this space, particularly in the Uberization of farm equipment, are serving millions of smallholder farmers. But we need to assure quality service from these service providers to add value to the farming, rather than the cost of the service pricing it out of the reach of the farmers. So as I was talking, we had the picture of the globe with the spider's web of all the linkages of what's going to happen with climate change. And even as I was talking of simple things like new varieties, we're responding to climate change. And yet, as we put those new varieties in, it's affecting the soil, it's affecting what we do to the varieties, it's affecting the value addition. it affects the transportation. Everything is so interlinked. And I could see in some of the roundtable discussions later, we have some very knowledgeable people focusing on their subject areas, which is vital. I often feel that we speak multidisciplinary, but we don't often do it. We try very hard, but particularly in government, trying to get different ministries to work together, to try and get the health system, for example, to say, climate change, malaria might be increasing, that's a bit obvious because it affects us all. What are they seeing in health about the effects in Hyderabad on the non-communicable diseases where people cannot afford to keep cool? So we have so many challenges to feed and nourish our population. And some of those challenges are caused by us. Mildly embarrassing, we know that we cut down forests. We know that we cement over our cities because it makes it easier to move around, but stops the groundwater percolating away. So some of these challenges are due to our action and also due to our inaction. And climate change, for me in agriculture, is such a challenge because our food and nutrition systems are so multifaceted, so networked and interwoven and form a three-dimensional net where everything is affecting everything else. But almost 4 dimensions because time moving forwards, everything is going to get more and more complex with more challenges being thrown at us. So these challenges need us to look at the very best of our current technologies and to work in a multidisciplinary way, a genuine multidisciplinary way, to find the solutions that we and our planet so desperately need. Thank you.